yes or no, whether you have talked to Vladimir Putin since you stopped being president?
Well, I don't comment on that, but I will tell you that if I did, it's a smart thing.
It looks like this is going to be a record breaker for the first day of early voting.
My first bill I will sponsor is to codify Roe.
When former governor had an opportunity to stand up for the women of Maryland, he didn't.
Hello, I'm Nancy Cordes in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Former President Donald Trump is in the battleground state of Georgia tonight after meeting with the Economic Club of Chicago earlier today. Georgia kicked off early voting today with turnout already breaking records from last cycle. We're going to have a lot on that tonight. Later tonight, Trump will participate in a town hall, a take two, after the former president's Q&A near Philadelphia last night turned into a listening party.
Go and vote. Let me hear that music, please.
The songs played for more than 30 minutes after the event was paused for medical emergencies. Trump did not resume taking questions. Meanwhile, Vice President Kamala Harris is in Detroit. She stopped by an art gallery and is sitting down for an interview with radio host Charlamagne Tha God. It is the beginning of a busy week campaigning. Tomorrow, she sits down with Fox News for an extended interview. We're going to start tonight with Nicole Killian in Atlanta and Ed O'Keefe in Detroit. Good to see both of you out on the campaign trail. Nicole, you are in one of the most important states this cycle. Early voting just started today, already smashing 2022 records. What are you seeing on the ground there?
Yeah, well, we're seeing what we have seen over the past several years, having been down here during those midterms where we did see that record turnout. It really comes as no surprise that already on this first day of early voting, they have surpassed some of those daily records with well over 200,000 people casting their ballots. And of course, early voting here will stretch almost to Election Day. So we're talking a roughly two and a half week period that people will have here in the Peach State to get out and vote. But probably what was most interesting about what happened when we first got here on the ground, and as you know, Nancy, these types of things don't happen very often when you meet voters, but we coincidentally happened to meet two voters, one who voted for Vice President Kamala Harris, the other who voted for former President Donald Trump. They just happened to be standing in line together and spoke to us about their decisions. So you have a difference of opinion.
Yeah, but that's okay. I mean, we're not fighting each other, but we both listened, and yeah, it was just odd that it happened to get one of each at the same time. Yeah. I don't dislike him because he chose Kamala, but that's the whole idea behind the American voting system.
So again, one of them decided to support Vice President Harris, basically telling me that democracy was top of mind for him in the sense that he felt if the former president is reelected, that it would ultimately lead to chaos in this country. But then the other gentleman you heard from there countered, who's supporting former president, saying, well, he thinks that there will be chaos if Vice President Harris is elected. And the big issue for him was strictly immigration and the border. So as you heard there, even though they had differences of opinion, they were quite civil about it. And while they didn't know each other heading into the polls, it sounded like they could continue their discussion after voting today, so much so, maybe they'll sit down and have a beer later.
Well, it is nice to see that they can disagree agreeably. Ed, you're in another critical state, Michigan. The vice president focusing in particular there on shoring up support among black men. How exactly is she doing that? Is she making any inroads?
Nancy, good to be with you from Motor City. She's here this afternoon, having already stopped by a conversation with business owners and now sitting for an interview with Charlamagne Tha God, as you mentioned, the radio and talk show host. A critical exchange, potentially, because he's somebody who has been sort of on her side and critical of her in the past. And in this case, she's clearly trying to win over his support and that of his listeners who listen across the country. This comes as there is, if anything, at least more attention on ensuring that she's getting the support needed from black voters overall and black men in particular to turn out in the numbers they would have turned out 4 years ago for President Biden. While she enjoys roughly 87% overall support from black voters nationwide, which is on par with 4 years ago. If you look at the black gender gap, the number amongst black men is down. And you think to yourself, well, why does that matter? Well, it matters here in Detroit. It matters in Philadelphia. It matters in Milwaukee. It matters in metro and suburban Atlanta as well, because voters in those battleground states are black, are Latino, are white, but especially in these big cities in the Midwest, they can help shore up Democratic support. So you're seeing this extra attention put on them here today and for a few other days in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania tomorrow. We talked with an imam earlier today from Detroit, Mikhail Stewart Sadiq, who's someone we've spoken to before, that sort of helps us track black support for Harris here in Michigan. And we asked him to give us a sense why it is he thinks, or no, what we asked him is, what is it he thinks the vice president needs to be doing in order to shore up that support? Listen to this interesting answer. So, I mean, if she called or someone on her team called and said, what do I have to do to win Detroit? You would tell her,
keep pushing back on the misbehavior of Netanyahu. He is almost trying to ruin American politics, and his political proxies here, that sanctify his regime at all costs. I mean, that's just un-American. It's not at the interest of a robust American democracy to give people faith in our electoral process, and even to benefit the American plurality. So they have to push against him.
The imam's answer is telling, Nancy, because of course we've focused so much in the last year on Muslim American and Arab American support for President Biden, now Vice President Harris, in the wake of what's going on in the Middle East, because they make up such a sizable percentage of voters here in the Metro Detroit and Dearborn area, that he brought that up just hours after it was reported that the Biden administration is now telling Israel, you have 30 days to boost humanitarian aid to Gaza or you will see U.S. support held back. Immediately here in this battleground state where that issues matter more than any other, he was hearing it and he was saying, you need to be doing more of that, Madam Vice President, if you expect to find the votes you need.
Right. Sounds like the White House is getting that message. Nicole, I want to turn to Trump's impromptu music session last night. Let's take a listen to some of it and then talk about it.
Put on Pavarotti singing Ave Maria. Nice and loud. Turn it up louder. We want a little action here. Turn it up louder.
So it wasn't just Pavarotti, it was James Brown, it was Guns N' Roses. Has the campaign explained yet exactly why Trump decided to stand on that stage and play music for his supporters for 40 minutes?
Yeah, I mean, there has been no formal statement from the campaign, but a source tells us that, the former president was basically trying to be sensitive to the situation because there were 2 medical emergencies that occurred, which is part of why this event was cut short or why that Q&A got interrupted. At least one person fainted. Took a while for a response to occur. And, this is something that we have seen at some of the former president's events, not only indoor events, but even some outdoor where, there are these medical emergencies because you have people who have been lining up for hours waiting. And unfortunately, these types of situations do happen. But beyond that, we haven't gotten really any further detail. What we can tell you is that the attendees who were at that event last night didn't seem particularly bothered or disturbed by what happened. But certainly it's something that the Harris campaign is seizing on, saying that the former president looked lost and confused. And even the vice president herself tweeting out earlier today, she hopes that he's okay.
Yep, she's got more rallies in the next 24 hours, and she'll probably make mention of that again. Nicole Killian and Ed O'Keefe, thank you both so much. Vice President Harris and former President Trump are neck and neck in Georgia. The Republican nominee narrowly lost the battleground state to then-candidate Joe Biden in 2020. CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto, joins us now to discuss. Hey, Anthony, great to see you. Okay, so how do we watch Georgia, especially now that early voting is actually underway? And what do the campaign's travel plans there tell us about this race?
Hey there, Nancy. Yeah, this is as good a day as any to kind of geek out on the Georgia map, right? So this is the 2020 election in Georgia. And the first thing you notice is all this blue around here, Metro Atlanta and Atlanta, where Democrats, where Joe Biden need to run up big margins, why we keep talking about turnout. There's another story in there, though, and that is all those places have been trending towards the Democrats over the years. They're diversifying, they're fast growing. There's a lot of college graduates there. In fact, I will show you here in this version of the map, these arrows represent the way that the votes have been trending, in this case from 2016 to 2020. The rural areas in red moving to the right, moving more towards, in this case, Donald Trump. Now, I should add, Joe Biden didn't flip those counties necessarily, but he did build on margins that you had seen Hillary Clinton start to gain, and other Democrats have been increasingly doing well in Metro Atlanta and around there over the years, right? Now, the other part of this is, let's talk about turnout for a second, because here in Metro Atlanta, you get big numbers, and sometimes you look at a map and you go, well, you know, okay, blue dots, red dots, how do you look at that differently? I'm going to turn Georgia on its side here for a second, and you're going to see the higher bars here represent more votes in Metro Atlanta, the flatter areas, fewer votes. So you start to see in a relative sense just how important Democratic turnout is in running up the margins there in that area, Nancy.
So are there particular areas of the state beyond Metro Atlanta that you are going to be watching over the next few weeks and on election night?
I sure am, because what you also want to look at, besides Metro Atlanta, is this stretch all through here, get down through Augusta, even down here in Savannah, where you see the blue for Joe Biden, and then the outer ring of these Metro Atlanta suburbs. Let me show you this, because I'll show you an example of when Brian Kemp won in Georgia. Watch that closely, and you're going to see them turn a little bit lighter blue. And what that tells you is that if he can hold down those Democratic margins in those outer suburbs, and this, I'm talking about Trump in this case, if he can do that, then that's kind of a pattern like Brian Kemp had. That's a pattern for a Republican to win the state, Nancy.
Fascinating. Anthony Salvanto, thanks so much for walking us through it. And speaking of Georgia, a judge in the state has ruled that officials there have to certify election results even if they claim to suspect voter fraud. In an 11-page ruling, Fulton County Superior Judge Robert McBurney told officials they need to have results certified by the state's deadline, which is November 12th, 7 days after Election Day. He noted that any suspicious fraud should be shared with authorities, but that they are not, quote, a basis to reject the results. The ruling came from a lawsuit brought by a Republican member of the Fulton County Board who argued she had discretion when it came to certification.
People have fought for my right to vote. The very least that I can do is get up at 2:30 in the morning, get here by 4 a.m. to attempt to be the first one in line.
That is dedication. Early in-person voting is now underway across Georgia. We are in the Peach State, where Harris and Trump are neck and neck. You're streaming America Decides.
I've always thought about the importance of the vote because I think it was instilled in me by my father.
This is a very important election, and so I think mostly everybody will be out here trying to cast their votes.
It's an important election, and we're really a critical state in that election, so I feel honored to be voting.
Welcome back. The Georgia Secretary of State today said that voters there have surpassed all daily records for any day of early voting in 2022. 16 electoral votes are up for grabs in the Peach State, where former President Trump lost to President Biden by less than 12,000 votes back in 2020. Let's bring in Tia Mitchell. She is the Washington correspondent for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Tia, it's great to see you. So as of 3:30 this afternoon, Secretary of State Raffensperger said that more than 234,000 people had already voted. What does that say about how voters are feeling in Georgia 21 days out from Election Day?
Yeah, I think it goes to show that not only are the candidates very invested in Georgia, but it shows that Georgia voters believe that it's important that they weigh in, that they know the stakes of this race. They know that they are a battleground and every vote in Georgia is going to count. Georgia is expected to be close. And so it's in the margins. And I think people are just fired up to have their voices heard. I also think, quite frankly, voters in Georgia understand that the sooner they vote, the sooner the texts will stop coming to their phone, the emails may stop, as you know, the data centers realize that this voter has already cast their ballot. So I think a lot of Georgia voters are, quite frankly, ready to be done with it. And so just overall, whether it's for positive reasons or just to be over with, Georgia voters are ready to go.
No more texts is certainly a powerful incentive. Is there any way to determine at this early stage whether either campaign has an advantage when it comes to early voting there?
Yeah, I think you would give early voting and voting by mail the advantage to Democrats because, in recent years, former President Donald Trump has continued to send mixed messages about voting early and voting by mail. Sometimes he encourages his supporters to do so and tells them, get your vote in early. But then there are times where he talks about how he doesn't trust that voting early and particularly voting by mail, he doesn't trust that those votes will be properly counted. So I think because of that mixed message from the leader of the Republican Party, whereas Democrats have been much more vocal and consistent in encouraging early voting, that's why you would give the edge to Democrats.
That makes sense. Former President Bill Clinton was in the state over the last few days campaigning for Harris. How helpful is it to have him or former President Obama there in the state campaigning for her?
Yeah, both former presidents are part of the many surrogates that are fanning out for Willis across Georgia. I would guess that high-profile surrogates had probably a half dozen events today in Georgia for Harris. Of course, Donald Trump himself is in Georgia today, but former presidents Clinton and Obama are really speaking to different types of voters that are important if Vice President Harris is going to win. We know Obama is spending a lot of time speaking to Black men, for example, whereas Bill Clinton went to more rural areas, speaking not just to Democratic voters in more rural areas, but perhaps some independent and kind of those reluctant Republicans who aren't sure if they want to support Donald Trump. So, but again, all types of surrogates are fanning out in all types of ways.
So 3 weeks from tonight, what are you going to be watching as we start to see the Georgia results coming in?
So I think we'll be watching to see what share of the electorate votes early. We expect it's going to be a big share. Georgia has pretty robust early voting. It goes all the way through the end of the month, roughly 2.5 weeks, almost 3 weeks. There will be some weekend early voting. We know the total vote in Georgia is about 5 million. So the question is, again, what percentage of those votes come early versus waiting until Election Day, especially because we do, again, think that Democrats will have an advantage with early voting. I think we'll also see how turnout is all across Georgia. We know the population center is Metro Atlanta, and it's, Atlanta and its suburbs. But what does voting look like in rural Northeast and Northwest Georgia? What does voting look like in other cities like Augusta and Savannah? Those will all be data points that we'll be studying.
Especially because Harris has spent so much of her time in the state of Georgia, but outside of that metro area around Atlanta. Tia Mitchell from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Democrats in Congress seek to prevent another January 6th-style riot at the Capitol. What we're learning about their efforts coming up. You're streaming America Decides. We have all seen images of the horrors that took place at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, and now Democrats in Congress are working to prevent history from repeating itself 4 years later. Our Scott MacFarlane reporting that, quote, Democrats have researched and discussed plans to ensure security is tight, and they've begun efforts to debunk emerging conspiracy theories about undocumented migrants voting in federal elections. Scott MacFarlane is here now with more on his reporting. Scott, this is fascinating. How do congressional Democrats think they can even make a dent in all of these conspiracy theories that are floating around? I was just in North Carolina. It was amazing how many voters I talked to who believed those theories.
There's so many things that need to be done to protect against post-election chaos, because there's any number of directions it can come from. Some of what they're planning is relatively simple to understand. Some of it's next level. Let's start with the easy stuff. The members of the House Committee on Administration, they have offices right there in the Longworth building across from the Capitol, have been talking about security, first of all, ensuring because they have oversight of the Capitol complex in their portfolio, all the security is in place to prevent a recurrence of January 6th. Got a lot easier because it has been designated a national Homeland Security event, so all kinds of resources are going to be on the grounds at the Capitol January 6th. That issue is pretty much put to the side now. It's taken care of. What about the election conspiracies about non-citizens voting? Well, that's a harder nut to crack because, as you mentioned, some of that is really enmeshed in people, but because they have federal voting law in their portfolio, they're trying to do messaging to push back on that. But here's the tricky thing. They are game planning or strategizing how to respond if there's a complication on January 6th we didn't see last time. Like, what if there's no Speaker of the House chosen by January 6, 2025? Doesn't seem that far-fetched since there wasn't a Speaker of the House chosen on January 6, 2023, when there was a standoff with a narrow majority. And there's a prospect of a narrow majority again in the U.S. House. They're actually trying to figure out, how do we navigate this? How do we ensure the electoral votes are counted as they're supposed to be if there are no rules of the House, no organized U.S. House, and no Speaker to sit there in that chair? Talked to a number of constitutional law scholars, and so have they, by the way, who say there's likely no way Congress can block a constitutional mandate like counting the electoral vote, but that sure is a foothold that could be used to obfuscate or block the clean process on January 6, 2025, and they are planning for that.
Right, or at the very least delay it. So is D.C. going to look like a fortress then on January 6th?
Ever since January 6th, every event of magnitude at the Capitol's had that fencing, that no-climb, 8-foot-tall black metal fencing. I would bet the mortgage you're going to see that type of fencing surrounding the Capitol again, not just on January 6, 2025, but likely for some time before then. There will be federal Homeland Security assets helping the Capitol Police. There's mutual aid, local police departments there, too. This feels like a hardened target for January 6, 2025. And all the people in this space with whom we speak about vulnerabilities post-election say, look instead to softer targets. If somebody's going to try to obscure or obfuscate with what's happening between November 5 and January 6, maybe they try to bring those efforts towards more vulnerable places where there's less resources, smaller communities, swing states, places where they don't have a war footing. The Capitol, I think, is already clear they're going to have a war footing.
You're talking about all the things that Democrats in Congress are trying to do. Democrats don't control Congress. The House Speaker himself, who is a Republican, has been reluctant at times to say that Donald Trump lost the last election. What impact does all that have? Are Republicans going to actively try to block some of these reforms that Democrats are trying to make?
Yeah, and the Republican House Speaker has been pressed on this before and said, as long as it's a free and fair election, he sees no reason that it would go challenged or mitigated. That being said, Congress has done something to insulate either party from trying to mess with election results. They passed this Electoral Count Reform Act after January 6th. In fact, they passed it in late 2022. What it does is it raises the threshold of what number of members of Congress are needed to try to object and stop the count. It used to be just one. Any one member of the House and any one member of the Senate could stop the count cold. We saw that on January 6th. Now it requires 1/5 of each chamber. May not be a heavy lift to get a 1/5 of the U.S. House to want to do it, but there seems to be confidence. It may be difficult to get 1/5 of the U.S. Senate to be part of that effort. They think that insulates some of this.
That is fascinating. Scott MacFarlane, thank you so much for breaking it down. Appreciate it.
We have an enemy from within, which I think is much more dangerous than the outside enemy.
Vice President Kamala Harris takes aim at President Trump over those comments. Our political panel will weigh in next on what she had to say. You're streaming America Decides.
Donald Trump is increasingly unstable and unhinged. And he is out for unchecked power. That's what he's looking for.
That was Kamala Harris delivering one of her sharpest attacks yet on former President Trump during her rally in Erie, Pennsylvania. In amplifying her warnings of the dangers posed by a second Trump term, the vice president also played a short clip of the Republican presidential nominee repeatedly complaining about the, quote, enemy from within. Our political panel joins us now to discuss. Finn Gomez is our CBS News political director, and Adrian Carrasquillo is a national political reporter. Welcome to both of you. Finn, great to be here with you. What do you make of that new strategy of hers actually having a big screen at her rally and playing clips of Donald Trump? Is that designed to get under his skin?
I think it's designed to get under his skin. It's two things. It's designed to get under his skin, and also it's actually borrows a page from his book, frankly, Nancy. He does that a lot. I mean, he plays a lot of videos at his rallies as well. But I think it's also, on Harris's part, an effort to really showcase she is a prosecutor, right? She's laying out her case in this final stretch, the closing arguments, if you will, and showing the evidence to her base and some of those, persuadable voters saying, look, this is what he's saying. This is real. Listen to me. I have a different option.
Right. So that's such an interesting way to put it. Obviously, she'd hope to prosecute the case in a second debate, but that is not going to happen. Adrian, is this going to be a successful strategy for her? I mean, Finn talked about persuadable voters. Are there any persuadable voters left at this point who will hear those messages about Trump being unhinged and maybe move in her direction, or are people just too familiar with who he is at this point?
I think it's so important to listen to those words she's using, right? Unstable, unhinged, unchecked power. And what it reminds me of is another word that starts with UN. It's unfit, right? What she's saying is in her closing message here that Donald Trump is unfit to be president again. And actually, I do think that it does reach undecided voters and voters that are still trying to make up their minds. I heard that the Harris campaign was doing focus groups with undecided Latino voters where they were realizing that January 6th was something that was mobilizing, a mobilizing issue. We saw her talk about that at the Univision town hall. And apparently that immigrant men, this mobilizes them because they don't like January 6th and they don't like this idea that he wants to be a dictator on day one.
That is fascinating. I want to ask you about something else that a lot of people have been talking about, and it was Trump's rally in Pennsylvania last night. He hosted this town hall just outside of Philadelphia. It turned into this impromptu concert where he played music while standing on the stage, kind of swaying to it for about 40 minutes or so. The Harris campaign obviously now mocking his behavior at the event. But Trump called the event amazing. What do you think voters think was going on there?
You know, I was thinking about this, and the only thing it reminded me of was his friend Steve Witkoff at the Republican National Convention, who said Donald Trump loves music and he loves to be the DJ at events. So I guess that's something that voters didn't really know about him. But, you know, ultimately, I think it's just interesting that he stopped taking questions and that he sort of 30 minutes early decided to pack it up. And again, I do think it actually leans in and it helps the Harris campaign with their message that this guy, he's not ready to be a president a second time.
What are you hearing about that unusual moment on stage last night?
Well, one, I think there should maybe be a dance-off now that we're 21 days out to the election. No, but in all seriousness, I think, Nancy, I think it allows for Vice President Harris to bring up the mental acuity argument again in this last stretch. There is that age difference. Again, we know about it because Donald Trump used to go after Joe Biden on it. And now, because of that age difference and her questions that kind of are similar to that Nikki Haley's arguments also during the primary, it's about mental acuity. And I think this, even though the Trump campaign is saying, look, there were some medical emergencies, you know, he was pausing to reflect that, to take time for that. But it wasn't a very unusual campaign rally. And I've been to like 80 Trump rallies, Nancy's, and this is very, very unusual. So to me, it's like, again, it brings up an opportunity for her to utilize that mental acuity argument against Donald Trump.
Right, and he's done a couple of interviews lately, one a new podcast interview with Bussin' with the Boys, another with the Economic Club of Chicago, where he basically defended his style, saying, yes, I get off topic, but I call it the weave. And, sometimes he doesn't weave back to where he was supposed to be going in the first place.
I mean, his base supporters didn't leave. They didn't leave the rally, according to Caitlin Ewing-Burns, who was there. However, if you're trying to appeal to, again, to those persuadable voters, those moderate Republicans, and they see that, I mean, it's just, it's kind of the sense like, what are we buying into? And I think that's the argument that Harris is trying to make in this final stretch.
Adrian, you recently wrote for Politico about the importance of the Hispanic vote in this election, how consequential these Univision town halls could be in swaying Spanish-speaking voters. Talk to us a little bit more about that ahead of Trump's own town hall tomorrow. We know Harris did hers about a week ago.
Yeah, Donald Trump, interestingly, his campaign chose to do sort of like a homecoming. We know that Florida is his adopted state. He's in Miami. Miami, of course, Miami-Dade County, a place where he grew with Hispanic voters from 2016 to 2020. They told me they want to talk about unsafe streets and an unaffordable economy. So we can see him talking about those. The third issue they talked to me about, which I didn't put in the story, was that they want to talk about family issues, which they said was trans issues. So, interesting that, and again, these are Spanish language speaking voters. Democrats typically have an advantage with these voters, but Donald Trump is trying to eat away into those margins and see if he can take some of them away.
While we have been speaking, a very interesting interview has been taking place between radio host Charlamagne Tha God and Vice President Kamala Harris. They spoke specifically about one of Trump's biggest knocks on her, which is that she stays relentlessly on message to her own detriment. Let's take a listen to that conversation.
And a lot of your press hits get criticized. Folks say you come off as very scripted. They say you like to stick to your talking points. And some media says you have...
That would be called discipline.
Ooh, okay.
That would be called discipline.
Right.
What do you think of that response?
Well, I think she is on message. That is, sort of like her... but that's her thing, though. I mean, she's a prosecutor. She's laying out her final closing argument to voters, right? This is what she's doing. And right now, I think what she's saying essentially is discipline is something that you need to have this presidential timber to really to be in the Oval Office. And I think in hearing her say that, she's trying to showcase that, right, Nancy? And I think you contrast that with the undisciplined, right? We're talking about the unwords again, the undisciplined, strategy and even last night's town hall that you're seeing from the Trump side. That may be a way to contrast herself again.
Right, and that show directed towards an audience that she is trying to reach specifically, which is black men.
Absolutely, and and Charlamagne Tha God has a huge reach, right? And I think that look, we had new numbers out this week that shows that she matches the exit polls from Biden in 2020 with black voters, right? She needs to hold that leading into these next 21 days. And it's not about the fact, it's not whether they're going to vote for Donald Trump, it's whether they will show up on Election Day, and that's what she needs, especially if she wants to win in these crucial battleground states of Michigan and Pennsylvania.
Such a good point. Finn Gomez, Adrian Carrasquillo, thank you both so much. The battle down ballot, the races we are watching that could decide which party will be in control next year. Stick around for that. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Whether or not the next president can get their legislative to-do list done will depend on who is in charge of Congress after November. Control of both chambers is expected to come down to a handful of tight races across the country, and that's why we've got an expert here to talk about them. Hunter Woodall joins me now. Hunter, great to see you. You've picked out a few fascinating races to discuss. Let's start with a race in Virginia pitting two veterans against one another.
Absolutely, Nancy. I mean, this is a seat held by Abigail Spanberger. She's not running for re-election. She's aiming to run for governor of Virginia. So this is a battleground district race, one that Democrats have benefited from winning in recent cycles. But they're struggling this time around. They have Eugene Pittman, who has the kind of profile that would normally profile well with Democratic voters. He's closely associated with the first Trump impeachment. But he's been struggling lately, and Republicans have coalesced behind Republican Derek Anderson. And the energy in this race has been tilting more towards Republicans recently. And at a time when Democrats are eager to win back the House, this isn't a race they really want to be worrying about. This is a race they should have comfortably in their column.
That is really interesting. Yeah, they were hoping to hold that one. Nebraska Republican Congressman Don Bacon is also facing a tough Democratic challenger in a state that is supposed to be a red state. What's going on there?
Don Bacon has been one of those Republicans who's consistently won, even though Democrats have constantly targeted him, tried to oust him. It seems like this cycle might be the time they succeed. Democrats are incredibly confident in this race, surprisingly so, but Republican allies of Don Bacon have talked to me, and they talk about how he outlasts Democrats. He's outlasted his current challenger before. They think he'll do it again, but the problem is, too, this is a district that gets a lot of attention because it has an electoral vote. Nebraska allocates some of those electoral votes by congressional district. Kamala Harris wants to win this electoral vote in Omaha. That means a lot of Democratic attention in Don Bacon's district.
Oh, that's not what he wants to see. Okay, let's talk about the Maryland Senate race that pits Angela Alsobrooks, a protege of the vice president, against Larry Hogan, the former governor. They had a debate this week. Let's take a listen to a bit of that.
The stakes of this election could not be any higher. We are facing an election where the future of our country and our freedoms are at stake. What we recognize is in this election, a woman's right to choose is on the ballot.
What we see today is nothing but divisiveness and dysfunction in Washington, where nothing ever seems to get done. Our country is being torn apart by the extreme voices on both sides.
So what are you seeing in that race? A lot of analysts say if there is any Republican who could win a Senate seat in Maryland, it would be Larry Hogan.
The race Hogan is running here is fascinating. He's technically branded himself as, you know, he wants to be the Republican Joe Manchin in a way. He wants to be that person that obviously is a bipartisan member of the conference, but is showing more that he's willing to stand up for the values that he sees. It's not clear that Republicans want a Joe Manchin type on their side of the aisle in the Senate. And Larry Hogan, when I talked to voters in Maryland around their primary day, they talked about, hey, I voted for Hogan before. He won the governorship of a blue state twice, but they don't necessarily want it. They didn't necessarily want to send him to the Senate. I mean, and that's a challenge that Hogan keeps running into.
Well, that's fascinating because Republican hopes of winning back the Senate definitely run through Maryland. That's one of the paths that they'd like to take. Hunter Woodall, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Early voting is also underway in Ohio, and some high school students have already made their way to the polls. First-time voters in Dayton, Ohio, recently took part in a big celebration, students marching through the city streets accompanied by a local marching band to a local polling place. This event happens every year. It celebrates newly turned 18-year-olds who are about to vote for the first time. Some younger students also came along for the event to see exactly how the voting process works. How new legislative maps could impact several races this November. We'll hear more from a candidate whose district has been impacted. You're streaming America Decides. This election season, many voters are casting their ballots in legislative districts that have been newly redrawn to account for population changes based on the 2020 census. In some states, the politicians who control the redrawing of congressional maps can change district lines in a way that maximizes their party's advantage. And for many of those who may not know, this process is called gerrymandering. Major Garrett is here to dig into this subject with us now. Gerrymandering, technically known as when the districts have all those squiggles and look very misshapen.
They're either misshapen or they're drawn specifically for maximum partisan advantage. Sometimes neighborhoods don't have contiguous representation, meaning it's not all neighborhoods linked together. Lines are drawn. You have an urban area maybe several hundred miles away attached to an exurban area. Just because if you draw the lines that way, the party in power can maximize the votes most likely to keep it in power. And we traveled to two places where that's been true, Illinois and North Carolina. In North Carolina, interestingly, registered Republicans and Democrats about even, but the state legislature is a supermajority Republican.
Wow.
North Carolina redrew its lines after the census, and under a Democratic-led Supreme Court, those lines were upheld. But then Republicans won control of the Supreme Court. They allowed the Republicans to redraw those lines, and we went to figure out what happens on the ground when those lines are redrawn. We met a woman named Kate Barr. She's a Democrat running in a redrawn state Senate district in North Carolina. She has no chance of winning, and that's the point. Let's listen to Kate Barr.
North Carolina's voting maps have been drawn to ensure that, at least in this case, the Republican Party will keep their power almost no matter what. And I'm running to call them out, even though I can't win.
How much of a no chance is there, statistically?
I think I'm supposed to lose by 27%. So it's like the Mount Everest plus of a political gerrymander.
The Mount Everest of political gerrymander. You didn't see her full shirt, but it says, Kate Barr, I can't win. She hands out bracelets that say, I can't win. When she knocks on doors and canvasses, she says, I can't win this race, but I want to talk to you about why I can't win this race to illustrate the point. We also went to Illinois, met a guy named Rodney Davis, served in Congress for 10 years from a relatively swing district. Illinois Democrats redrew the maps after the census, drew him out of his district, and he's lost a career in Congress because of it, because he couldn't compete in a neighboring district, which was much more Republican, much more Trumpian. And what happens, Nancy, is if you've been a congressman or a legislator from a swing district and you suddenly have to run in a deeply red or deeply blue district, your habit of compromising, which is what you have to do to please a 50-50 district, becomes a huge liability. It was for Rodney Davis, and he lost his seat in Congress.
And not only does it hurt the party that is in the minority in any given state, but it also hurts the voters because these seats are drawn in such a way that they are safe for one party or the other, and they have less of an incentive to do what the voters there want them to do.
And the voters feel almost disenfranchised from the jump. Like, there's no competition here. Nobody asks for our opinion about anything because they don't have to. When there's no competition, it's a layover race. And when it's a layover race, all you have to do is make sure your primary voters are pleased, not the broader electorate.
And so how prevalent is this? How many states have maps that indicate that gerrymandering is the law of the land?
About 10 or 12, and it varies. Oftentimes, if you have a one-party state, meaning the Democratic or Republican governor and the legislature all the same, these things tend to intensify. But North Carolina is an example where you have a Democratic governor, but that Republican legislature. So even though power is divided at the top, the Republican legislature redrew the lines to favor the GOP.
And how will this affect 2024? I mean, Congress is so evenly split right now. Are there states where gerrymandering could have an impact on the control of the House?
Let's go back to North Carolina. It redrew its map, as I mentioned, after the 2020 census. Then that map was reassessed by a new Supreme Court, led by Republicans. Before the Republicans reassessed that North Carolina map, the congressional delegation from North Carolina was 7-7. 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats. After this election, Nancy, it could be 11-3. 11 Republicans, 3 Democrats.
Wow. That could have a major impact.
That could have a significant impact.
Major Garrett, thanks so much. Looking forward to seeing your piece on the CBS Evening News tonight.
Thanks, Nancy.
And you can watch that full Eye on America piece on the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell. It airs tonight on CBS News 24/7 at 10 and 11:30 Eastern. And finally, we hit pause on politics in Washington for a little positivity. An unbearably cute pair of pandas catching the attention of everyone here in the nation's capital. The FedEx cargo plane dubbed Panda Express, carrying Bao Li and Qing Bao, touched down in D.C. just before 10 o'clock this morning. Pandemonium ensuing as local news went wall to wall, covering the 3-year-old furry diplomat's trip from Dulles Airport to the Smithsonian National Zoo. It was like a presidential motorcade. This is the first time in 24 years that D.C. has welcomed a new set of pandas. The endangered animals will be quarantined for at least 30 days, so you'll have to bear waiting a little bit longer to meet the zoo's newest residents. They are not expected to make their public debut until January 24th. That's unbearable. Well, that does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report with John Dickerson starts right now.